Hello and welcome to Ipsos's latest edition of Understanding Society, in which we are talking about the cost of living crisis and what that means for Britain's finances and Britain's public services. We're very happy to be joined by Mike Brewer, who is the Chief Economist and Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, who of course many of you will know and have been doing lots of analysis around the economy and the state of the economy we're in and what it means for us all. So thank you very much for joining us, Mike.
It's great to be here.
So I'm just going to start off with a bit of historical background. We've been tracking at Ipsos public opinion on the economy for decades now, and our trends show that concern about inflation is at its highest point since right at the very beginning of the 1980s, and the level of economic pessimism is as low and as perhaps long-lasting as we saw in the financial crash in 2008. But from your analysis, and you've released a report looking back at lessons from history, what do you see the comparisons between the current crisis and previous crises that we've seen in the UK?
Well, I think the public are right to be very concerned about inflation. And inflation right now has not been as this high since the early 1990s. So that people's perceptions are matching reality very well there. But when we look back at previous crises, I mean, the strongest message is that this is a very unusual crisis. This is not an economic downturn caused by a failure of labour demand. It's a typical way in which countries go into recession. This is driven entirely by the cost of particular goods going up, by high and rapidly rising inflation coming from the cost of essentials, effectively energy. And that means that the shape of the economic downturn is going to be very different from previous ones. We have basically full employment right now, and although unemployment may go up next year, it's going to remain extremely low for what's a recession. Because instead, what's happening is we've got this big rise in the cost of energy. It's going to make us poorer as a country. And what's happening is we're going through that painful adjustment process of everybody, governments, businesses, households, all becoming a little bit poorer as a result. And that recession we're going through is almost like while we sort out exactly how becoming poorer is distributed or shared amongst everybody in the economy.
And yes, and that's a really interesting question. Actually, it's something that we've looked at in other articles in this edition that people will be able to read. How is that distributional impact different for different groups of people? I mean, we both have worked together actually on projects in the past on the views of different generations, and the Resolution Foundation have done an intergenerational audit on the UK. What are the generational differences and the differences between different income groups as well that you're seeing from this current crisis?
Well, let's start with the income differences. Of course, much here does depend on government policy. So the government can do a great deal to affect who loses out the most from the cost of living crisis. But because the cost of living crisis is coming through a rise in the price of energy, there are several reasons why we might expect low-income households to be hit the worst. The first reason is that energy and other essentials like food, which is also rising rapidly in price, they take up a larger fraction of the budget of low-income households compared to high-income households. The second is that the things which are going up in price right now are basically essentials. So if food and energy go up in price, you don't have much choice but to suck up and bear it. You can't really stop, you can't stop eating, you can't stop eating. And thirdly, low-income households would have gone into this crisis with fewer buffers, fewer coping mechanisms, less resilience than high-income households. If you wind back to the pandemic, what we saw there was that households on average managed to save quite a lot, primarily because there were many months where we weren't allowed to go out, weren't allowed to spend money. And the UK as a whole saved a lot in the pandemic, but that was also very distributionally skewed. The extra saving went mostly to high-income households, and many low-income households struggled during the pandemic. So low-income households went into this crisis, which of course comes so soon after the pandemic, with lower levels of financial resilience. So we've got all these three reasons which work together, which make us basically predict that low-income households will be harder affected than high-income households. And we can see that already in many of the data that's coming out. The Office of National Statistics in the summer was asking people about how they felt about their energy bills. And although everybody was finding energy bills hard in the summer, it was far more likely that for low-income people to say they were finding it difficult than high-income people. And then a more recent survey, from the ONS, was showing that people in the most deprived areas, the most deprived fifth of areas, over half of those were already cutting back on food and essentials at a much higher rate than we find in the more affluent parts of the country. So there's going to be a very strong, that's even with the government support. We can probably talk about the government support later, but even with all the government support this year, there is still a very strong distributional skew to this crisis.
And so on that, what does that imply for government and for policymakers in terms of how to respond to that distributional skew to help people through and to help the most vulnerable groups through the cost of living crisis that they're facing?
We've seen already a great deal of support from the government in this financial year. And in the autumn statement a few weeks ago, Jeremy Hunt told us how he was going to support us with energy prices next year. The government is very aware of how cost of living and high energy prices affect households. And most of the measures this year, the measures this year are providing some help to everybody. So we're all getting £400 off our electricity bill. Most of us got £150 discount on our council tax back in April, but there's much more support for low-income households. What we know for next year is that the energy price guarantee will carry on, but at a higher level, so higher bills for households, less money being spent by government. But the government will carry on with these targeted cost of living payments. And so actually overall next year, the way the government's helping people with higher energy bills is actually is more skewed towards low-income households. It's more progressive than is the case this year, where there's quite a lot of universal help. So I think the government knows this, and its response reflects the fact that energy is an essential, and energy costs bear down more heavily on elderly households and on low-income households. The issue is, of course, that these are incredibly large rises in the price of energy that we're seeing.
Okay, and let's talk about then another group, which I know you, as I said, you've looked at, which is the difference between generations. And I think in your report, you've shown how different generations and different age groups, everyone's being hit, but in slightly different ways. And in our data also actually shows, for example, it looked like millennials were particularly badly affected by the crisis in 2008. Not quite so clear yet whether Gen Z are feeling quite as pessimistic as millennials were then. So there may be some potential good news, but of course there's still lots to play out for the cost of living crisis for younger people. What does your data show?
No, it's a really great question, and there are some very interesting intergenerational things going on in this crisis. So you're at the long run trend. Stepping back, you're of course absolutely right. The long run crisis is for the most recent generations, most recent cohorts, to feel hard done by compared to their predecessors. And that's partly because, as you say, the financial crisis really hit millennials, those born and those born subsequent to that. They've really been struggling in the labour market ever since, struggling with low wages. And millennials and people born 1970s and afterwards have also been less likely to be homeowners than their predecessors. So they've been sort of hit adversely by the rapid rise in asset prices and house prices. So the sort of long run generational story is that more recent cohorts are feeling hard done by, and the older cohorts, the baby boomers and so on, are doing very well. But that's not how this crisis is so far playing out. So we looked at this in different ways. So the first fact we looked at is just who's paying the biggest energy bills. And here it's basically the people who've got the largest houses. So which tends to be people in late middle age. So those people who maybe sat out the pandemic in their comfortable detached houses with large gardens outside of cities are now sitting in large houses which are expensive to heat. So we found that it was households headed by 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds who are expecting to face the largest energy bills this year. If we look at energy bills as a fraction of your income, which is probably a slightly better guide as to how hard it is to bear those costs, then it's the elderly, those aged 75 or more, who will see the biggest change because of the energy crisis, and who will be sort of spending the largest fraction of their income on energy bills. If we looked at why that is, that's partly because older people tend to own older homes, and older homes tend to be less well insulated. So we looked at the fraction of houses, which are in the A to C grade of energy efficiency. So the government wants all houses to reach an A to C grade of energy efficiency by the 2030s. At the moment, only a third of those owned by pensioners, those over 65, meet that category, where it's around half of households aged under 44. So older people tend to have owned their homes for longer, and so their houses tend to be older and leakier and less well insulated. So that's one reason why you might expect it was the oldest people to be struggling the most because of the energy price crisis. But there are other dimensions too. We looked at which sorts of houses are most likely to have prepayment meters. Now, prepayment meters mean that your energy is more expensive per unit, and it also removes your ability to smooth your energy, your spending on energy from the summer to the winter. So we are particularly worried about people on prepayment meters as we go into the coldest months of the year. And on prepayment meters, it's youngest households who are most likely to be living in a household with a prepayment meter. So there are lots of different things going on, and overall, our data matches yours. When we asked people who was most worried about the energy prices, it does tend to be young people. So that could be reflecting the prepayment meters. It could also be reflecting that as young people have fewer savings to fall back on, less financial resilience, as we've already discussed. But there are definitely some interesting tweaks to the intergenerational story that we usually tell.
And I think also what's interesting about that and your answer just there is also it shows how the sort of the cost of living and the inflation and the economic difficulties that we're facing, it seeps into a whole range of other areas of public policy, such as housing, such as the move towards net zero and insulation and better energy efficiency of homes, and the implications of all of that. This is not it's not just a purely economic crisis in theory. It's something that has implications for a whole range of public services.
That's right. The long run story we might tell about the British economy is this slowdown in productivity. It's a labour market issue. Where we looked at what happened in the pandemic. Of course, there were massive health consequences, but primarily the way the pandemic affected the economy was through the labour market. People lost their jobs or didn't lose their jobs. It's kind of fairly simple. This is a crisis which is having more widespread effects. Everybody is affected by the cost of energy, and as you say, there are different ways in which the cost of energy is affecting people. And of course, we must remember it's not just affecting households in different ways. It's also at the same time affecting businesses as their input costs are changing, and it's affecting public services because public services have to pay higher energy costs. And the way we think about responding to the crisis, as you say, involves issues to do with housing policy. It involves the welfare state and the social security system, and it's all wrapped up in our move towards net zero and our long-term need to get to reduce our dependence or eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. And maybe let's go back to some of the reasons behind the crisis. I mean, you've talked about long run issues around labour productivity, and obviously the specifics around the energy crisis. The public understands that there are a range of different factors. They know it's not just one thing. If we ask them, they say it's things like, the recovery from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the state of the global economy generally, all having an impact on the state of the economy and in the UK and the rate of inflation. But they're also holding government policies to account. They're perhaps actually sort of slightly increasingly and more so than some other countries blaming the policies of the government. I mean, kind of broadly, if we're looking at all these different factors, are the public right? What are the key drivers behind this crisis?
The public, in this instance, the public are definitely right. The primary cause of the high cost of energy right now is the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But prices were rising generally before that. So if we go back in time about a year or so, we were beginning to see inflation pick up then, and that was due to the recovery from the pandemic. Basically, during the pandemic, many people shut down production, factories shut down production, supply chains stopped, people stopped exporting. And then in 2021, when countries started to emerge from the pandemic, the global economy tried to start all at the same time, and that put businesses, factories, supply chains weren't able to respond immediately. So we had these cost pressures building up anyway as the pandemic ended. The war in Ukraine has just made that so much worse by putting up energy prices a great deal. That's the fundamental reason for the cost of living crisis. Is the global economy a factor? It's not so much the global economy as a factor. It's that all countries are affected by both of these things. All developed countries were seeing cost pressures as we emerged out of the pandemic, and most developed countries, well, basically all developed countries, unless you're an energy exporter, are affected by the high cost of energy. So what's going on? So most developed countries are going through the same sorts of things as the UK, and that just weakens generally the global economy. And then, yes, the public are pointing to government policies as being a factor here. Of course, government policy is doing a great deal, as we've already discussed, to help people through the cost of living crisis. But we did also have that period this summer and early this autumn with a Conservative leadership election and Liz Truss being Prime Minister, where we got a very vivid example that government policies can have very quick and in some cases quite detrimental impacts on the economy. And I think that has heightened people's awareness of the power of government. But fortunately, as I say, a great deal of what the government is doing this year is helping households and businesses with the cost of living crisis. And what we got a few weeks ago from Jeremy Hunt, of course, was some idea of how he's going to carry on doing that next year as well.
Yes, so let's talk about the autumn statement that came up, as you say, quite recently. The Resolution Foundation have done a lot of analysis on that and the implications of it, and it's clearly something that affects many of the areas we look at in our understanding society this year. Jeremy Hunt talked about the kind of the very difficult decisions that the government was facing. It was a new direction for their economic strategy under him and Rishi Sunak. Broadly, we found that the public support certain elements of it, particularly maybe the more targeted policies around windfall taxes or increasing taxes for the higher earners, the 150k band type. The public will also accept, have never been terribly fond of high levels of spending on foreign aid, so they're okay with freezing that budget, but they are concerned about broader brush measures such as wide-ranging increases in tax that affect everybody, such as council tax or VAT, and are also obviously concerned about spending in public services. So what was your view of the autumn statement? What were the most important announcements, and what's the impact of it going to be over the next few years?
Jeremy Hunt, Chancellor, had an incredibly difficult job putting together this autumn statement. We think he had three main challenges. The first was that this was his first opportunity to hear from the government's official forecaster, the Office of Budget Responsibility. It was his first time to hear from them how how badly they think the economy has been affected by the cost of living crisis and what that means in turn for public finances. The second thing he had to do was try and calm financial markets after the turmoil in September and October, and particularly to reassure those countries and those organizations who we want to lend us money in the year ahead. And his third challenge was deciding how to protect households and businesses and the public services from cost of living challenges. So dealing with any one of those alone would have been difficult. Dealing with all three together, it was an extremely challenging situation for the Treasury, I think. So what did he do? Well, in the short run, he has acknowledged that the country is facing these higher costs, and so he announced more government spending for some public services that are feeling the strain the most, particularly schools and hospitals. And he set out how households will be protected from high energy bills in 2023. In the long run, he set himself a target that the level of debt, the debt to GDP ratio, the amount of debt we have as a fraction of our national income, will stop rising in 5 years' time. That's his new fiscal target. That is a very, very loose fiscal target. It should be very easy to hit that target in the grand scheme of things. But even achieving that required him to announce significant tax rises and significant spending cuts for 5 years ahead. Yeah, 5 years ahead. So let's look at the kind of who should be pleased and who should be disappointed from that package of measures. First of all, on the energy price support, on the energy package next year. So how are households being protected from high energy prices next year? Well, first of all, the energy price cap will be set at a higher level than it was this year. So households will be paying more for their energy bills in 2023. And as we've discussed, there will be more of the lump sum payments, but only for those who are on benefits or receiving the state pension. And I think that does pose challenges for households who are on a low income or even on a middle income and are finding things tough at the moment, but are not receiving universal credit or are not on the state pension. There are definitely some cliff edges and some possible unfairness in what the Chancellor announced. If we think about the tax rises that are coming up, so that the Chancellor announced £25 billion worth of tax rises for 2027. It should be said, of course, that actually most of that revenue is going to pay for the cost of not going ahead with the health and social care levy. So that was the one of the tax cuts that Liz Truss announced, which has not been U-turned on, is going ahead. So we've got £25 billion of tax rises coming up, announced by Jeremy Hunt, but about 15 billion of those is paying for that cut in the health and social care levy. What he did announce was a whole series of freezes and thresholds, which affect everybody paying income tax, and then targeted tax rises for those on very high incomes by lowering the point at which you start paying the 45p rate of tax and increasing taxes on capital gains and dividend income. So this was a very progressive set of tax changes where 70% of the extra taxes announced by Jeremy Hunt will fall on the richest fifth of households. And then if we turn to the public spending changes, well, as I said, the Chancellor announced extra public spending in the short run, but just for education and health to try and help them cope with the cost pressures they're facing. And goodness me, we can certainly see the pressure the health service is under right now in all the stories about waiting lists and time spent queuing in accident and emergency. But he announced effectively he took some money out of public service budgets in the medium term. And I think the really big question there is whether that is a feasible set of targets or forecasts to set. That the more politically cynical will notice that most of these public spending cuts will happen after the next election. But even if you're not being politically cynical, the numbers that Chancellor has penciled in, will take spending in. If we look outside the unprotected parts of government, typically governments protect spending on health and education. If we look outside of those areas, then the government's plans will take real per capita spending back down to their level in 2014. And given the pressure we are seeing on public sector wages right now, and you know, as we record this, there are many parts of the public sector on strike or threatening to go on strike. It does seem that the government's plans could come under significant pressure over the next few years.
And as you say, is that something that's likely to hit particular public services, or even the big spenders like health? Are they going to, you know, and sort of benefits, of course, sort of they were broadly being upheld in terms of inflation, but is it likely to hit any particular public services or areas of public spending particularly heavily, or is it going to be tough for everybody?
Yes, we should also give the government credit, as you said, for increasing benefits in line with inflation next year. There was, of course, lots of speculation in the summer and the autumn that the government would not do that. Inflation in September was 10%, and it was widely rumoured the Chancellor might increase benefits or pensions only in line with average earnings growth, which was about 5%. But he did decide to increase benefits in line with inflation next April, which I think is the right thing to do, given how the cost of living crisis is bearing down on low-income households. But in terms of the future cuts, well, no, the Chancellor didn't give many details at all about where they will fall. Governments typically set very detailed spending plans for about 3 years in the future, where you can see what each department is getting, and beyond that, they only set the totals. And the cuts the Chancellor announced were only to the total, and he hasn't yet said how each department will fare, after the next election. We do know that capital spending is set to be cut by more than spending on public services. This is almost inevitable. It's much easier to cut capital spending than it is to cut current spending. If you cut current spending, then you basically have to stop the government doing something that it's doing now, or you have to fire public sector workers. If you cut back on your capital spending, it just means that you're delaying starting some project for a few years. You're pushing something back. People don't notice it as much. So inevitably, the plans the government announced cut back on capital spending by more than current spending. And as to which parts of current spending will suffer, as I say, we don't yet know that, but the numbers really do look very tight and very tough, particularly if pressures remain in our health service as they have been doing so far this year.
So let's talk about the future. We've heard lots about growth plans, for example, over the past few months, and you've talked about some of the underlying issues facing the British economy around productivity. The government's maybe taking a slightly different approach to growth than it did under Liz Truss, but still clearly that's the ultimate objective. What do you think the government is trying to achieve in terms of putting the economy back onto growth, and what are the maybe the short and long term things it could be doing in terms of policy solutions to get the economy improving again?
Well, I don't think we really heard from the current government what is their ultimate strategy for growth, and I think one of the difficulties that the UK is facing is we have had some political instability over the last year or so. So although we've not had a general election, it's been the same government. There have been so many changes in the ministers and the prime minister that it's just not really, it's not quite clear whether things that were announced a year ago are still government policy or not, which is a very unusual state of affairs. So I don't think we really do know what the current prime minister, what the current cabinet, what is their growth strategy. In the autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt talked about the importance of growth and nodded at a few areas. He talked about he pointed at some areas where he thought that deregulation could give the sort of boost to the economy that the financial sector got in the 1980s, but without really giving any details. So the first thing I'd want to see from Jeremy Hunt and the business secretary is, well, what exactly is your growth strategy?
And what sorts of things would you be suggesting that they look at? I mean, I know you've looked at it as well in terms of working hours and the situation facing part-time workers, but sort of broader solutions as well that they could be looking at to improve the economy.
Yeah, I mean, if you had to point to one reason why the UK economy is performing poorly, it's about investment and about our capital stock. So if you compare the productivity of a typical worker in France compared to a productivity of a typical worker in Britain, sorry, the French worker is much more productive, can produce much more for every hour that they work. And the overwhelming reason why they can do that is because they have access to more capital, more machinery, more technology, more innovation. And that reflects that for many years now, the level of investment in this country has been significantly lower than it has been in comparative countries. So business investment is about 10% of GDP pre-pandemic, compared to 13% in France, Germany, and the US. And that 3 percentage point difference doesn't sound very much in one year, but when it's every single year, basically it compounds. And as I say, the level of capital, machinery, technology, innovation that workers get to use in other countries is just much greater than it is here. So that's the fundamental reason why we are less productive than our competitors, and why wages have been flatlining. And the government needs to address that. Sorry, needs to do things to change that. Now, how can it do that? I think if you ask businesses, the first thing they will say is, well, we would like some stability, please. We'd like stability, not just political stability, but also policy stability. And then they will also, they probably point to the tax system, where I think the government has made some sensible changes over the last couple of years. And then what we pointed out in our research, and we're doing a large project at the moment about Britain's future economic strategy, is that it's not going to be enough just to get growth, just to get investment and growth. You might say I'm sounding a bit like a trickle-down economist, just saying all we need to do is get growth and then everything will be okay. That's not the case. We need to get growth, because without that, living standards and wages will continue to flatline. But we need also to get growth to be more equally shared. We called the UK a stagnation nation, which reflected that not only that was economic growth so slow, but we were also a very unequal country. We're almost the most unequal country in Europe, and we're second most unequal country in the G7 behind the US. And we think that combination of low growth and high inequality is particularly harmful for low-income households and their living standards.
And that's interesting. Actually, that's something that was brought up in our other interview in this with Linda Yeo, and she talked about the importance of equitable growth, and how that needs to be key for the government. It obviously also it plays into the levelling up agenda, which is something that, again, maybe one of those policies where it's not totally clear where the government is in terms of its plans for it, but that nevertheless is probably a really important piece, and it's something that the public are very keen on, even if they're a bit pessimistic and skeptical about it. But in terms of concerns about inequalities in public spending regionally, and by type of area, we can see that in our own Ipsos levelling up index. We can see that there is real concern across places like the north of England and Wales, and in legacy mining and industrial areas. There is a real concern about those aspects of regional inequality on the economy, but also on other measures such as well-being or pride in place and investment and so on. So that could be another aspect for the government to still be thinking about, rather than forget. They don't want to forget about the importance of levelling up completely.
No, I agree entirely. There was much to applaud in the Levelling Up white paper under Michael Gove a couple of years ago, and we at Resolution Foundation will be really keen to see that agenda come back. It's important not just for equality, but also for growth. One of the things we did point out in a report last year is that Britain has one very productive city, which is London, and then the second and third most productive cities are really some way behind. Again, if you look to some of our comparator countries, and not just the US, but also the European countries, they have highly productive second and third cities as well. So in France, you can look at Marseille, for example, and Germany has many highly productive cities. So we think an important part of Britain's growth strategy is getting growth going outside of London. And that doesn't mean that every single part of the country will turn into a a high wage, high productivity superpower. But we really do need to think hard about what can we do to increase productivity in our other big cities, in our Birmingham, Manchester, and in the northeast as well. And then we have to accept that not everywhere can be a high paid service intensive city, and so we have to think about what can we do to make the sort of jobs that are done all over the country into more rewarding jobs, maybe better paid, but more importantly, more rewarding, maybe less stressful, less insecure, so that everybody feels the benefit of economic growth when it does come back.
Yes, and that's actually mirrors things that we find in our own research, our own employee research. It's not always pay that is the biggest driver of job satisfaction. It's often other factors as well. I mean, that's all really interesting. Thank you, Mike. I mean, are there any and as you said, some of those things affect businesses perhaps and business investment as well. Are there any more specific things you think could be done to improve that level of investment or policies that government could do to help that happen?
Well, we're doing our 2 or 3 year project on Britain's future economic strategy, and so far we've done a great job at diagnosing the problem and the challenge that we have right now. We're doing this work jointly with the London School of Economics, is to come up with the solutions. So come back in half a year's time. I'll have some great answers.
Okay, that's great. No, we definitely will. We'll look forward to that. Okay, I mean, maybe perhaps just to finish off then more broadly. I mean, as you say, we've talked about the challenges, and there's a lot of really interesting analysis and data out there to understand what the challenges are, how it compares to the past. Maybe lessons we can learn from other countries, and what the immediate future is going to be like. But maybe going back right to the very beginning, we know people are aware of these challenges. There is a high level of concern about cost of living at the moment. Optimism about the economy is low. There is a sort of a general sense maybe that the country is not being as successful as it could be, and we can see the implications of that. We can see implications of groups who struggle most with their finances tend to have lower levels of well-being and so on. But trying to finish off maybe with a more optimistic note, is there any economic good news on the horizon? Are there any areas of opportunity that Britain can be taking advantage of, that government and public services and people can be taking advantage of?
In terms of economic good news, there isn't that much coming up, is there? We do think that it is widely expected that the pressures on energy prices will abate during 2023, and indeed by 2024, energy prices should be falling rapidly. But of course, so much of that does depend on what happens in Ukraine. So this is unlikely to be a really prolonged cost of living crisis. This is a fairly short and contained cost of living crisis. So most people expect that wages will be growing again in real terms. The economy will be growing again in real terms in 2 years or so. But stepping back more broadly, yes, I was quite damning about the UK's recent economic performance in the 2000s, with our low growth of productivity, which was leading to low wage and low living standards. But the UK does have many strengths. We are still a prosperous country. We are a world leader in service exports. We have world-class universities and research. We're highly innovative in many areas which will be important in the future, such as life sciences and pharmaceuticals. And we have a great deal of soft power coming from our cultural and educational exports, where we are, of course, lucky to speak English, the global language. So the UK definitely has very many strengths, and I think what we've been saying in our work on economic growth is what we need is the government to step up and come up with a strategy that embraces those strengths, accepts our weaknesses too, and comes up with a realistic strategy that will allow us to drive forward for the next 10 or 20 years.
Yes, and I think I saw that in one of your essays on the economy in 2030, talking about potential areas of opportunity, from digital to new technology to kind of potential benefits from a transition to a net zero economy that that could potentially create opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely, that's right. Yes, and some of these opportunities, particularly in net zero, will happen in parts of the country that are particularly could do with that right now. But with all the focus on new technology, of course, you mustn't forget that most of the UK's value add does come in services. Not just financial services, but services more generally, as well as in areas such as the arts, the entertainment, video gaming, for example. So we're not. Our future is not just in high tech manufacturing. It will be in value in high value services. But there, because of our background, because of our language, because of our institutions, we are in a good position to thrive globally.
Okay, well that's great to know. That's great to know that there could be some good news and that there are opportunities for growth and strengths in the UK economy that we can take advantage of in the future. That was great. Thanks ever so much for talking to us, Mike. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out for the work that you at the Resolution Foundation are doing on the future for the economy, and we hope you get a chance to chat again soon, but thanks very much for talking to us about your views on the cost of living crisis, where it is, how it's affecting all of us and our public services, and how it's looking for the future.
Thank you, Gideon.